Hello, World History class. My name is Mr. Q. You probably don't know me too well, but I'm the guy who's sitting in the back of the class. I'm the student teacher. I'm sometimes in your Google classrooms as well. But today we're doing an online class because you all missed your in-person class because of testing. So we're going to fix that for you and go through what you would have done in person online. So before we start this lesson, I just want to let you guys know that it's important that you have your note packet ready as well as the readings, because that's something that we're going to go through during this lesson. So we're going to start off with this crash course video. Today we're going to be talking about King Louis XIV. So this is right before the French Revolution, and it's a very important process. So let's see if this works.
Louis XIV, the French Sun King, painted when he was 63. Louis XIV looks regal in his massive black wig and swaths of ermine embellished with fleurs-de-lis, the symbol of the former French royal house. His high heels show off his shapely legs and white hose, demonstrating the king's perfection. Men's legs, garbed in tightly fitted stockings, were a key indication of desirability at the time, and while he may not appear super masculine to us, Louis XIV was the model of powerful kingship and indeed absolute power.
Okay, so that was a cool video because it really focused heavily on the style of the king, right? You could see his hair is huge, right? They say in the South that the higher your hair, the closer to God. I don't know if that was any connection with him, but it really connects to the supreme power that he tried to hold on to and that he tried to push out into the world. I mean, if you look at this photo, you see, a grandstanding person with huge fur cloths and, pretty powerful, pretty wealthy. You have the crown right in the corner. So I want you to look at this and think back to how this connects to our vision of what we've talked about before, absolute rulers. And then don't write anything down, but think about what are the symbols of wealth and power. I talked about a few, and what are symbols of power and strength, right? Think about those things as we look at this picture or painting. It's important to know that this obviously had a very good perspective for the painter to paint the king in high regard, obviously. But it's important because it's what the king wanted to show to his people and to the rest of the world. So think about that for a little bit. Strength, wealth, power, what are those aspects that are coming out of this painting? Right, so we are talking about the Sun King, Louis XIV, and then we're going to talk about a little bit the Palace of Versailles. The Sun King, we're at 210, so let's get started. So before we get into the king, we do really have to set the stage, right? So from the 1560s to the 1590s, France was engulfed in religious wars between the Huguenots and the Catholics. This was also known as the Wars of Religion. Now, it's important to know that the Huguenots were the Protestant the French Protestants, and the Catholics, most of them were Roman Catholics. So there was a lot of difficulties between these two religious groups, not to mention that the Protestant Reformation, which we just talked about, happened not too long ago, so that was still going on. But as we will see, most of these rulers within France have been Catholic. But then we have, in 1589, Henry IV. He was a Huguenot. He was a Protestant, right? And he inherits the throne. However, he decides to become a Catholic. That could be due because he knew that the majority of the country was Catholic. So he felt like he had to convert just to make sure he appeased the masses, right? But he also did a lot of things to benefit those Protestants, right? So he passed the Edict of Nantes, right, in 1598. And this granted the Protestants religious toleration and let them fortify their own towns and cities. So this is huge, right? You could tell that even though he converted to a Catholic, he still held the Protestants and their views deep within him, right? For a king to allow certain groups of people to fortify their own towns and cities is huge. And the fact that religious toleration, after we came out of a period of war between these two groups, is also huge as well. So then we go into Louis the 13th, right? So he takes over the throne after Henry the Fourth is assassinated. Unfortunately, he didn't last too long. So he takes over, right? And he appoints a pretty important person for what we're going to be talking about within this lesson, right? He appoints the cardinal, and he became his chief minister, and he's going to have an important aspect and an important role to play before King Louis the 14th comes into power, right? So the cardinals enforce two major policies, right? He goes against the edict that Henry IV put into play, right? But he allowed the Huguenots to continue to practice, right? But he said, you could practice, but you cannot fortify your own towns and cities. Yeah, that's not going to happen, right? But if you want to practice, you can practice, right? So it's the first step of going against this edict, per se, but it was still big that he allowed them to practice, so it wasn't that crazy. Two, he went after the nobles and he destroyed their armies and their castles, right? So he said, no, you guys can't have fortifications either, but gave them high posts in court, right? So he said, no more armies for you, no more, walls and barriers and territories for you, but what you can do is you can come into the court of the king, right? So he's making them dependent, the nobles, who were pretty independent people, making them dependent now on the king, right? And so what is this? It extends royal power, right? It's giving it's taking down the walls and the fortifications of both the nobles and the Protestants within France, and by doing so, he's expanding the authority and the extent of the royal power. So now we get into Louis the 14th, right? This is an important guy, and this is who we're talking about. We saw this painting a little while before. Again, still very flashy in all its glory. In the back, I didn't mention, that is the Palace of Versailles, which we will talk more about at the end of this PowerPoint lecture. But Louis became king in 1644, right? And he was only 4 years of age, right? So he was young. He really wasn't ruling at that time. His mother and the chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, I think if I said that right, who was handpicked by the other cardinal, were the ruling people, right? And they continued that process that was put in place that we just talked about before. And it wasn't until 1661 that Louis actually took over, right? He got older, right? A 4-year-old isn't going to rule too much. And he was considered the Sun King, right? The Sun King because the power that he had came from God, right? The sun. That's important to know because he was a Catholic. And he also believed that he had certain rights as a ruler, which we'll also get into a little bit later. So how is Louis XIV an example of an absolute monarch? Okay, so this is important. And in class, we broke up into groups and we did some small activities. But unfortunately, we can't do that because you're doing this online. So at this point, I would like you to go through the reading documents and think about the questions that I had put in them. So this is a good spot to stop and do those readings and then come back. Those readings are really important because they're going to give you a lot of information that we're going to go into as we go through this PowerPoint presentation. And there's also going to be stop points so that I can ask you questions that you'll have to answer. So it's important that you do those readings, so don't skip over them. But again, this is the perfect spot to stop before you do them. So now that you've done those readings, we break it up into different sections, right? His influences on government. So he said, I am the state, right? He believed in an absolute and divine right to rule. He said, there's no parliament. There's no nobles. I'm making the decision. I am the state. I get the final word. No one's going to go against me. I'm making the rules, right? And he believed that he had a right because he was king, he was Catholic, so he said that my policies are pretty much the policies that God would have wanted me to do because, not that he's the God in person, but he has the backing of God because God picked him to rule. Right, so he reorganized the army. Right? So I want you to think about this from the reading. What are some important things that he did to reorganize the army? Well, one of them is he said that the army has to fight for the king. They're not fighting for nobles, they're not fighting for anybody else, but they're fighting for me, the king. He also put uniforms and assigned ranks, right? So he took over the military, and he also reorganized it to say, now this is how you dress when you're one of the king's military men. And we're also going to have ranks. He increased his military from 100,000 about to 400,000 soldiers. That's a huge increase. And finally, he used the soldiers in France and Europe. I mean, if you want to change or, reorganize your army, the best way is to use them and figure out how to do that. And he did that. We're not going to talk too much about the wars he got into, but he got into a lot of wars. So this is an important aspect of how he reorganized the army. Second, he used indentents, right? These are royal agents. So if you can remember from the readings, what are a few things that they were important for? So these, like I said, are appointed agents. They collected taxes, recruited soldiers, and administered royal policy. And the king's orders were followed. They enforced these orders and made sure it was plausible throughout the whole kingdom. Right? So these are very important people. They're royal agents to make sure that the policy he is putting forth is being followed. And then we obviously have the Palace of Versailles, right? This is a huge palace castle. And this becomes the center of government outside of Paris because there was a lot of issues within Paris. So this is put outside of Paris and it's huge. One of the biggest castles that we have seen to date. One of the most beautiful as well. So now we're going to go into religious policy. We already know that King Louis XIV was a Catholic, right? But he wanted to unify France behind a Catholic country, right? He said, yeah, I'm not liking these divisions we're seeing, right? So that becomes a problem. And so in 1685, he revoked the edict that Henry IV put in place. So he said, yeah, there's not going to be any religious toleration anymore. You have to change to be Catholic now, right? Yeah, I'm not going to have you be Protestant or Huguenot, whatever. You're going to be Catholic now. And what was the impact of this? So I want you to think back on the readings. How did this reversal of policy impact the country? Well, unfortunately, the Huguenots were prosecuted, right? And they fled to different places like England, the Netherlands, and America, right? The United States. And you see, as America's forming, there's a big Huguenot Protestant population that forms where? In Staten Island, which is crazy because you think, well, there's a lot of Italians there, so they probably are Catholic. Yeah, as time went on, they went there and the Italians took over, but when it started out, the Huguenots were the ones who were the main people in Staten Island. So now we're going to talk about economic policy. And we have a person called Jean-Baptiste Colbert, right? Now, who is this person? I want you to think about that from the readings. Well, I don't need you to know terms. I just want you to know that he was the person in charge of the finances of or under Louis XIV. Right? And think back to the reading. What are some of those policies that he enforced and enacted? Well, one of them was that he reformed the system of tax collecting to reduce corruption. He said there's a lot of small tax collectors, and they are taking a lot of money off the top. And we need to stop that because we need all the money we can get to fight the military, to build the Palace of Versailles, and to kind of afford Louis's expenses. Higher taxes, but not on nobles. The nobles weren't going to pay higher taxes, so everyone else was, right? That's not too great. You kind of have a little unrest that happens then. But the nobles were pretty happy, so there wasn't going to be any immediate type of rebellion. He promoted mercantilism. Now, I know you guys know what this word is because of the fact that you talked about a lot of this when we were doing colonization. But mercantilism helped France become self-sufficient and led to new prosperity so taxes could be paid.